Let's get going tonight in our ninth lesson. This is our ninth lesson in our studies in Galatians, and for those who've been tracking along with us, you know that we haven't put anything up in a couple of weeks, and that's because we've been traveling and had different trips planned and just put them back to back so that we could just do them back to back and not spread them across the summer. And that meant we haven't met for a few weeks. Now, those who watch this later down the road won't miss anything, but I do like to say it for those who follow weekly, and I appreciate you coming back. I'm getting a lot of really great feedback on Galatians. I knew that when we picked Galatians, it would be a big one because it's one of those that have really become a big part of New Covenant people's theology. I mean, if you understand the New Covenant at all, you understand grace, you've probably had a journey through Galatians. And so it's made an impact on all of us. And that's not unusual. It's been doing that for 2,000 years. The church has been enamored of this little letter that Paul writes to the churches at Galatia, and for great cause. Last time we met, we were at the famous Galatians 2:20, and we dealt with 18, 19, 20. We sort of dealt with that ending part. I am crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet it's not I, but it's Christ that lives in me. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God. And we worked on that for a little while, and then we kind of jammed our way into the end of chapter 2, which is verse 21. And I think I spent 4 minutes on it. And then we kind of left it alone, said we're going to dig into 3. Well, I've had a couple weeks to think and reflect, and I don't want to move so quickly. There's some really good stuff at the end of chapter 2 that really is where the theology of this book has just taken off. This is where Paul's really getting his footing. In light of that, the idea that sometimes, I've never really had a problem in this meeting slowing down and taking our time with a verse. I mean, we spent years in John, so it's nothing for me to go, hey, let's be on this verse all week. But sometimes I find myself thinking that I should speed up. Had a little moment with the Lord this afternoon where the gravity of what we get to do really struck me. And I wanted to just share that with you and with those watching, because you're such a huge reason that we can keep going on. First of all, is that I appreciate you being here in this room, because the feedback just in the moment is valuable as you're teaching. The Spirit connects with your spirit. But it struck me so powerfully this afternoon that one little sentence uttered in the middle of a lesson, like right here today, could be the thing 2, 3, 4 years down the road. Somebody's going to watch this that they don't know me or you, or maybe they're on a whole different part of the road in their journey. And 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, they're going to come across this study and they're going to be, I want to hear about Galatians. And you're going to say one little sentence in the middle of 20 minutes into a 40-minute lesson that's just a throwaway line, or to you, to me, and it'll be the thing that turns the light on, whatever metaphor you want to use, changes their life forever, sparks their journey, and that shouldn't be taken lightly. Just the same way that I looked up a few weeks ago at our little church in South Carolina, and there wasn't a whole lot of people there, and I looked up and I had a moment where I went, what am I doing? And the Holy Spirit said, turn and look at them. And I did, and I heard him speak to my spirit and say, this isn't nothing. And they aren't nothing. And man, that sobered me. It was like a slap to the face. It's like, don't ever think it's nothing. And so I have that same sort of sobering feeling today, is don't think it is nothing, and take it very serious that someone might be affected in a way that transforms lives. And I know there are people watching who do give us feedback that that's exactly what's happened. And so I wanted to say that. I wanted to say it out loud, and I wanted to say it for the record. I'm not even really sure it has anything to do with this particular lesson, but I wanted to say it because it's important to me, and I want you to know that you are important to me, and that this is important, and it might not be every word for you, but it's important for someone, and that matters to the Father. Tonight, our lesson is titled a question: did Christ die for nothing? I want you to resist the urge to give a really quick no. Because of course he didn't die for nothing. And so it's easy to just read the question and go, no, it's not. He didn't die for nothing. He died for the sins of the whole world. Or some other verse that you've heard about the cross. I want you to resist that urge. And I want you to take the question at least semi-serious. Did Christ die for nothing? And of course, I'm not just making the question up. It's right in our text tonight that Paul poses this statement about Christ dying in vain. He poses a statement about Christ dying in vain. And then as 3 will unfold, which will be barely touched tonight, but as 3 unfolds, he throws a series of questions at the Galatian churches that are really built on this idea about the vanity of the cross. Does it matter? Did Jesus do all of this and then it doesn't really do anything because we don't, is it because we don't have a consciousness of it, or we don't let it, or we don't put our faith in it? Or what? And so resist the urge to just say, no, he didn't die in vain, and take the question serious. I will give you a concession. Yes, he died for the sin of the whole world. It doesn't matter if I do anything with that or not. He died for the sin of the whole world. I can't make the cross not have happened because I don't live right or believe right. He did what he did. Okay, I understand that. So let's don't just take it corporately then. Take this one personally. And ask personally, did Christ die for nothing, or did Christ die in vain? For me, in my own experience, the way I'm living this out, the best way to answer it is probably to say, by the way I'm living my Christian life, am I living it as if Christ died for nothing? Or am I living it as if his death mattered? And that's a good question to ask yourself, okay? And it's not a condemning question, it's a real question. Am I living in a way that reflects a Christ that died for a reason? Or am I living in a way that I could have done this if he hadn't died? And that's a biggie. And I would just preach joy last week at the garden, and peace the week before that, because it's righteousness, peace, and joy. And I said, peace and joy are going to be defined to you by the world, and I think this fits in here, is why I'm throwing this in. Peace and joy are going to be defined for you by the world, but their definitions don't need the cross. And so if you can come up with a peace or a joy that could have happened had Christ not died on the cross and raised from the dead, you might have a version, but you don't have the kingdom version. Otherwise, why do you need Jesus? You don't have to slap Jesus on stuff and call it Christian if you could have got there without him. Okay, well then that's a good inventory for all of our lives. So keep that in mind as we ask, did Christ die for nothing? You know, a lot of the times in our Galatians series, we've borrowed from Acts, because Acts is the bio of the New Testament. It's where a lot of action is happening. The Acts of the Apostles is really action. It's an action book. And I've done that because stuff's going on there, and I want you to see the action with the theology. You put those two together. There's another book in the New Testament that it's not an action book, but it's the most theologically Hebrew Jewish theology book in the New Testament that meets Jesus. Because you've got, and the reason I put those two together is in the book of Acts, you got a bunch of Jewish men who meet Jesus. They bring their Jewishness to their Christ. And then you watch this explosion, and it's really messy. Sometimes really messy. And Acts kind of plays that out. And then you get, so that's why we've used Acts when you get in Galatians, because Galatians' first couple chapters are messy. And so we get a good parallel. When the theology kicks off in Galatians, which is where we are, this plane is taken off. Theology, deep theology. But it's got a real Hebrew base. It's got a real Jewish base because the author, Paul, is Jewish. And so he brings a lot of Jewish stuff to the table because why wouldn't he? We bring who we are. Okay, when that turn happens, it's real theological, then we borrow from the book of Hebrews. Because Hebrews, by its very title, is written to a Hebrew people who are Jewish, who've met Christ. And then that mashup begins. And the book of Hebrews, to me, is a little bit complementary to what Acts does, where Acts plays it out. Hebrews is the theology of it being brought out. Moses and temples and angels and sacrifices and bloods and priests meeting Jesus and going through that veil of who Christ is from shadow to substance. Okay, so tonight we use Hebrews. And we probably will a lot from here on, because as you dig into the theology, you're going to use a lot of Hebrews. for that very cause. And so let's go Galatians 2:21, and then we're going to add a couple of Hebrews texts. I want to start where we stopped last time. At the end of chapter 2, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. There's our statement. This is what prompts the question, which is, did Christ die for nothing? I don't set aside God's grace. Let's just kind of lay this out in slow terms. I don't take God's grace and then push it aside, because if I could be righteous or just, same word, by keeping the law, that's what I would be doing. If I could be righteous by keeping the law, I could push God's grace out of the way, because if I could get there, why do I need it? Right? If I could get this, why do I need grace? Grace in my time of need? Okay, then I need to be needy. Right? I need to be needy, and then I need grace. And so if I could get all of this without grace, then why do I need grace? Let's just shove it out of the way. And we'll go so far as to say, if I could shove grace out of the way because I could be justified based upon my own actions, then Christ died in vain. Like, why do I need a Jesus if I could get there without him? Okay, so getting us to a place where we realize we can't get there without him, that's the crucial part. Let's add some theology to the theology. We use the book of Hebrews to do it. A couple different passages tonight from Hebrews 7. Verses 11 and 12, watch, here's priesthood stuff. This is Jewish talk. That's why I did that little intro. Therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, parenthetical, for under it, Levitical priesthood, under the Levitical priesthood, the people received the law. Okay. The law and the priesthood go together. Under the Mosaic law is the Aaronic priesthood. Moses and Aaron. When we talk Moses and Aaron in Christian terms, we think we're just talking about the two sort of figureheads of the Exodus. But we're actually talking about the twin pillars of the law, which was the commandments and the priesthood. If you had commandments, you needed a priesthood. Why? Because if you had commandments, you're going to break them. What happens if you break them? You need a priesthood. Because what's the priesthood? Priesthood's a conduit. So the law comes down from God, and the priesthood goes up towards God, so that this action can be continuous. So the law then becomes what God brings us, and the priesthood becomes our praise upward. If through that you could be perfect, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? Simple question is, the Hebrews believe that someday God's going to bring us a whole new priest. And he's going to be from a whole different line called Melchizedek. And Melchizedek's this minor character in the Old Testament that meets Abraham on his return from the slaughter of the kings. And Abraham pays tithes to him and he disappears. He pops back up in the book of Psalms in a prophecy, and then he disappears again. And Jesus never mentions him. And no other New Testament writer mentions him until Hebrews. And then Hebrews picks that theme up and goes, hey, there was a whole different priest in the Old Testament. He wasn't Aaron, he was Melchizedek. What's he all about? This is what Hebrews is asking. What's he all about? And why would we need him if the Aaron priesthood worked? Great question. Okay? Really, it's a great, if God gave the law and the priesthood, then why does God come and give you a different priesthood? Why? Why isn't this going to work? Well, if perfection could have happened, then we wouldn't need another priest. 12, for the priesthood being changed, of necessity there's a change of the law. So if this priesthood is to represent those who break this law, then what would, get rid of this, then what would this priesthood be? Okay, if this is this, then what happens if this is gone? Author of Hebrews goes, that's got to be gone too. If we're going to change priests, we got to change something else. So a whole new game. Another way of saying it's a whole new ball game. It's got to be different. And so Christ, the Christ figure that becomes Christ the priest, which we did a whole series on Christ the prophet, priest, and king. If Christ is the priest, then we've had a change from that which Christ is speaking to us. A little bit deeper down in Hebrews 7, verse 18. Like my hand illustrations. See, I wasn't just making that up. Because one hand, other hand. On the one hand, there's an annulling of the former commandment because of its weakness and its unprofitableness. Now this is pretty bold. This is a way of saying that on the one hand, it's weak and it's unprofitable. It's not doing it. Why? Because it just didn't make anything perfect. Okay. Here's the real argument. You know why it's weak and unprofitable? It's not changing anybody. It's not really helping people to be new. And at the end of the day, they want to meet God so that they can be new. And if all we're giving them is post-mortem new, fine. But that's a weak faith that can't make new. So the author says, on the one hand, we got to annul this because it's weak and it's unprofitable. It doesn't make anything perfect. On the other hand, there's a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. So on one hand was the law and the other hand was the priesthood. And so we got rid of this priesthood and put in a new priest. And the author goes, well, we had to because this thing doesn't work. It's weak and it's unprofitable and it's not going to change anyway. But the new priesthood will bring you a better hope. Oh, and by the way, priests are how you get to God. And this priest is so good at it, he'll actually draw you up to God. So this is a pretty powerful setup by the author of Hebrews. Okay, let's put the two together. Take what Paul said in Galatians and whatever the author of Hebrews, I don't really think it's Paul, but okay, if you want it to be Paul, then it's Paul. We don't know. But whoever writes Hebrews, they say something very similar. Let's mash them both up. Paul declared the death of Christ as being for nothing. I put air quotes around for nothing because it's in vain, for nothing. Paul declared the death of Christ as being for nothing if we could be righteous through keeping the law. Simple statement. If you can do this through your effort, you don't need a crucified Christ. That's Paul's argument. If by effort you can be made perfect, which according to Hebrews 7 can't be done. Why? Because this is weak and unprofitable and it isn't going to work and we got to get rid of both it and the priesthood. So we'll give you a different priest. We're going to have to give you a different set of standards. So the death of Christ is for nothing if we could be righteous through the keeping of the law. Hebrews, just put them together. Hebrews declared that if Israel's priesthood made men perfect, then Christ the priest would be unnecessary. Furthermore, Hebrews said the law was annulled because it was weak, because it was unprofitable, and it was incapable of making us perfect or incapable of making us complete. Now, when we keep preaching or teaching the law as the gold standard for living for God, that if you do it, God will bless you, God will make you righteous. According to both Paul and the author of Hebrews, we are preaching that which was weak and unprofitable, and so weak and unprofitable that it couldn't change anyone. And in churches obsessed with change, why do we keep giving people the law standards in order to bring change about when 2,000 years of Christian history, biblical study has taught us that the law wasn't making anything perfect? Okay, so if we've got a new priest, then we got to get this thing out of the way. And that sounds like this from Colossians 2, where Paul says in verse 13, you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him. How did he make you alive? I love that line right there. He made you alive, having forgiven you of all your trespasses. Okay, if he doesn't forgive you to God, the definition of him making you alive is forgiving you of all of your sins. Because then you get to really live free of guilt and condemnation for the first time in your life. You've never really, this is why I like to say to people that haven't met Christ, you've never lived till you come to Christ. Well, what's going to happen if I come to Christ? You step into the forgiveness of all of your sins. You don't even know what it's like to live guilt-free. You've never lived shame-free a day in your life. You've never lived condemnation-free a day in your life. You come to Christ, you get to know what it is like to breathe the oxygen of forgiveness. That's how God views you. He made you alive together by forgiving you your trespasses. Now watch this. He wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, that was contrary to us. That's this stuff. This is the handwriting, God, the finger of God on tablets of stone. God took that which was against you, that was contrary to you, He took it out of the way, and He didn't just annihilate it, He nailed it to the cross. So that the cross becomes the place where you see the love of God in expression, but you also see that God took all guilt and condemnation and anything that could be said against you, and He nailed it to that cross, and He disarmed principalities and powers and made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. In what? That's a little bitty word at the end, it, with a big, big meaning. He triumphed over them in it. Well, in what? I think it's in the entire thing. But it's really the front of the verse. He disarmed. What's disarming mean? It's not cutting your arms off your torso. To disarm is take your weapons away. Paul pitches the cross as the place where God took everything that was against you, what the book of Hebrews would call the weak and unprofitableness, and He nailed it to the cross. And He saw that as the weapon that the enemy was using, and now that it's been nailed to the cross, Paul felt like Christ had disarmed, taken their guns away, the powers and the principalities of this world. Or I like to say it this way, the only thing the enemy can use against us is our performance under the law. Christ's cross rendered the enemy unemployed because it disarmed him of his one weapon. The enemy doesn't have anything to really do because he doesn't have anything to use against you. You go, then why do I always feel so bad? Oh, great question. Why am I always messing this up? How much of our Christian walk have we spent putting ourselves back underneath some form of performance whereby we determine our value based on how good we lived or how bad we lived, good and bad. And that becomes the weapon that we hand the enemy to hound us, even though he's been disarmed of that weapon. How do we know that this is what this means? Okay, well, we're working off Colossians, where Paul says he disarmed them. Let's add Hebrews 2:14. Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, humanity is flesh and blood. Therefore, Jesus likewise had to share in the same. And if we're going to be in it, if we're going to live in this thing, Jesus was going to live in this thing. And He did that so that through death, He might destroy him who had the power of death, that is the devil. So Christ dies to destroy the power of the enemy. It's another word for disarmament. Let's take a look at that word for destroy, because this is an important Greek word. I want to show this to you in multiple spots. The Greek word destroy is katargio, and it's really to reduce to inactivity. I've heard this translated to render unemployed. So to reduce to inactivity or to take your job away. So Hebrews uses the phrase that Christ's death destroyed. Through death, Christ destroyed him who had the power of death, that is the devil. Or Christ katargioed. Christ reduced to the state of inactivity the devil. So how is he so active in our lives if Christ has reduced him to a state of inactivity? Okay, well, let's change the metaphor. He took his job away. He fired him. He rendered him unemployed. So how does he still have a job in our lives? I told you to individualize this tonight. How does he still have a job in your life if Christ rendered him unemployed? Who gave him that job? It's like the boss walks up and goes, I told you to fire Smith. Get rid of him. Well, if the boss comes back tomorrow and Smith's still there, the boss is going to tell whoever was supposed to fire Smith, do I need to fire you? Because I told you to fire. How does he still have a job? And the guy goes, well, because I didn't fire him. Or let's tighten the metaphor up a little bit. Oh, I fired him, But then he was hanging out in the parking lot and I felt bad. So I gave him his key card back and said, well, you can just come in here and hang out because you're friends with everybody. What am I doing with that metaphor? Well, it's kind of like this. Christ goes to the cross and renders our enemy ineffective. He takes all of his equipment and he nails it to the cross. And then we come along in our brilliant moralisms and theologies and religions and ideas, and we let him have his key card back so he can hang out in the break room. Because there's sort of a comfortable feeling with having him and his works around. Like it just makes me feel like I'm doing better if he's here. You go, well, that's a stupid... It's also, by the way, why Galatians 3:1 opens with, oh, foolish Galatians, or oh, crazy Galatians, or oh, stupid Galatians. Because Paul's kind of thinking that, going, why in the world would you open the back door and let the guy back in who you finally got fired? You've been waiting for that guy to go find a new job forever. Why would we let him back in? And we're doing that when we give him his job back, which is to use our performances. Now, we tend to miss this because we think that what the preacher means when he says that is we're going back under the thou shalt nots, and then we're doing something wrong and we're letting the devil beat us up with it. But I'm not even really talking about that. I'm talking about we put ourselves underneath a performance standard by which we think God blesses us, which is the language of our enemy. That if I could do good, God would bless me. And we go, well, that doesn't have anything to do with sin. That's just good Christian living. And that's the voice of the enemy. That's the snake in the garden going, did God indeed say? Because see, God's just not giving you all the info. If you ate that, you'd be like God. Don't you realize you could get closer to God? You could get God to bless you. You could get God to put favor on your family if you did this. And we go, let's just do that and we'll write a book about it. Like, here's what you got to do. If you want God to do this, and it's the pen of the enemy saying you can manipulate God through what you do. And why did we give him that job back? Jesus came to shut that up, to get rid of it. So if he's still working, it's because we slipped him his key card. And we went, okay, tell me what I could do to get in the good graces of God. I want to double down, though, on the inactivity. Just make sure you see it. I'm going to give you a couple more. Here's another one from the same author, Paul, Romans 6:6. We know that our old man was crucified with Christ, that the body of sin might be katargio. That's the Greek word. Unemployed, rendered inoperative. We were crucified so that the body of sin could be rendered inoperative. That we're no longer the slave of sin. I don't think Paul's trying to say we don't mess up. He's saying sin is no longer our master, because what's being held over us is not performance standards, which means we're immediately going to mess up and not be able to reach those standards. If we could render that inoperative, we wouldn't be a slave to the failure. Here's another katargio, and I got to cheat a little bit, and I got to sneak you ahead in Galatians, because it'll take us forever to get to Galatians 5. So if I wait to get all the good stuff from deeper in the book, we'll miss some good ones. And here's a good one from Galatians 5:4. And I'm going to use New King James and Old King James. I'll show you why. I'll start with the New. You have become estranged from Christ. You who attempt to be justified by law, you have fallen from grace. Estranged, Greek word katargio. I don't like estranged because it kind of makes you feel like what Paul is saying is, if you try to be justified by law, you make yourself a stranger to God. And it just doesn't theologically hold the weight of katargio. The Old King James is a little closer. Christ is of no effect. Not bad. It's not that Christ didn't do anything. It's just it can't affect your situation because you've tried to be justified by the law. You are fallen from grace. I do like the fact that the New King cleaned up the absolutism of this verse in the King James, because notice the way the King reads, Christ is of no effect. I like that. And then it goes south. Whosoever you are justified by the law, you are fallen from grace. You're never justified by the law. It's impossible. You can't be justified by the law. New King cleans that up. You've become estranged from Christ. I'm not crazy about that, but they get this better. You who attempt to be justified by law, you've fallen from grace. There you go. Because you can't actually be justified by law. All you're really trying to do is be justified by law. But what do the moment you try? You fall from that position of that was given to you. Given to you. That's what made it a grace position. Given to you. Absolutely yours to have. So this was what urged this slowdown tonight. Because I was going to start in Galatians 3 and just rip right through those, try to get through those first 8 or 9 verses. Paul asks those questions. We're not going to get that far, even next week. But, what was I thinking? But we weren't going to do any more in 2. But then I really saw this week, and I've tried to craft this in a way that sounds more like me, but also says what caused me to be here in this. And I could have opened with this, but I wanted to work to it so that this made sense, okay? So it's a little bit of a lengthy paragraph. It's just my ramblings, but let me work through it with you. The tragedy of modern Christianity is that we are actively trying to render Christ unemployed. He has disarmed our enemy, who could only use our performances against us, and we spend our Christianity trying to work for the righteousness that has already been paid for. When we do this, we reduce Jesus to inactivity. Our attempts to be blessed, favored, and declared righteous based upon what we do or do not do make it as if Christ died for nothing. Short version of that, Jesus rendered the devil unemployed in the guilt and condemnation business because he doesn't have anything to hang it on. And then we get saved and spend the rest of our lives trying to render Jesus unemployed by paying God off with good works. And we drag him up in front of him all the time. And we've turned church into rallies of morality, making sure people are living right, pointing out everybody that's living wrong. And we turn into the Pharisee and the publican real quick. We need to be more publican than Pharisee. Remember the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. The Pharisee comes in and goes, God, I'm not an extortioner. I'm not an adulterer. And I'm really glad I'm not like that guy. And he points at the publican. And then he goes, and I fast twice a week and I tithe everything I got. And that's his whole prayer. And then on the other side of the room is the publican who hangs his head and beats his breast and goes, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And Jesus says, only one man goes home justified. This is, by the way, Galatians and Hebrews in action. Jesus goes, only one man goes home justified. And everybody listening knows it's the publican. Jesus goes, it's the publican because he's the only one who came in there to die. I mean, essentially that's what Jesus is telling us. He's the only one that came in there to die. Everybody else is bringing their stuff. And I pointed this out for those who watch all of our sermons sequentially. You probably heard me say this pretty recently, but what really strikes me there is that that's sort of the progression of how we handle self-righteousness. The Pharisee walks in and names a bunch of sins he doesn't do. And we're really good at that in the church. We point out sin. Did you guys watch TV this week and see that show? And then we've got 4 sins to talk about. And I tell you what, I saw that, and it's always sin. But that's not good enough for us. All that does is just get us fired up, just gets us all hot and excited about sin, but it ain't good enough. We can't just leave it there and then preach Jesus. That would be bad enough. I don't honestly really think that the good news needs a good thin layer, a thick layer of manure in front of it so that the good news smells better. But, if that's you, fine. We can't even let that rest. Then we got to start naming names. Because the Pharisee goes, I don't do this, this, and this. He could have just shut his mouth, but instead he goes, and I'm really glad I'm not like that guy, because that's the next step in self-righteousness. It's, did you see that? Have you heard about this? Here it comes. Ready? So-and-so, I tell you, I saw that guy. Boop, boop, boop. Point. It always becomes real people, because if it ain't that, it doesn't make us feel good enough unless we can name some real people. And then step 3 in the self-righteousness gravy train is, here's what I'm doing to prove that I'm better than that. He picked fasting and tithing. He could have picked 10,000 things because God knows we come up with enough of them. So he picked the best two he had, because why would you pick the worst? And he throws the best two he's got in front of God, contrasts that with a guy that walks in and goes, Lord, have mercy on me. And God goes, that's how you get some grace right there. Just take the gift that's given to you and receive it with humility. And any other attempt is an attempt to take Jesus and hand him his pink slip. And I can do this. And I don't like to be that guy, but I really think that we could pull a lot of the stuff off we're pulling off in church without a crucified and resurrected Jesus. That's why we're so excited about self-help and people telling the truth, and instead of going to the cross and what Christ has done to die on our behalf and resurrect and do so in us, we pull everything else in as a way in an attempt to find something that can only be done in Christ. So let's ask the question again. Did Christ die for nothing? And I said, resist the urge to just go no. And if you resisted that urge, now you got some equipment. The truth is that no, of course the cross worked. Whether you like it or not, the cross worked. But did he die for nothing for you? Well, I don't know. But I know I've had to ask this question a lot. And I'm embarrassed at how many times that I will ask myself this question and realize that I'm sure not acting like he died for a reason. And that's what I hear the Holy Spirit saying to me once in a while is, son, you're not acting like I did much. I don't know why you think I need this and that and that and that and that, or why you think I'm going to do something because you do something. If this is the way this deal works, quit getting up and talking about the cross. And I don't like being talked to like that by God, but your dad knows how to talk to you if he's a dad that loves you. And that's how the Father talks to me. And I'm not proud of it, all right? I'm not, but I also don't want to lie to you about it. I don't have this figured out. The answer that Paul White gives is, did Christ die for nothing? Is sometimes I sure do act like it. And I sure do pray like it. And I sure do live like it. And that's not good enough. I want to live as if he died for everything. As if there's nothing left for me to do. As if I know I am loved and I know my dad's got it. As if, because there's still hints in me that he's holding stuff back from me because I'm not quite what I should be. That if I had turned left when I turned right, that if I would just do this instead of the way I'm doing it, that God would open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing on me I don't know how to contain. I still hear the sound of that in my head, and sometimes I bring that to the Father. And I need these lessons because I need to hear the answer to the question that only I can answer for me. Did Christ die in vain? Well, let's put it together, shall we? Let's close by putting together the last verse of Galatians 2 and the first verse of Galatians 3. And I want to remind you that Paul didn't break them into chapters. And so Paul is just simply on a roll. So what would the next thing you'd say if you asked, if you brought up like, hey, you want to set the grace of God aside because you think you could be justified by the works of the law? Well, then Christ died in vain. What would the next line out of your mouth be if you thought your audience was doing that? Let's put those two together. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. Oh, foolish Galatians. I get it. That's kind of how you feel. You go, that's really ridiculous. Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified? Now, I'm not even going to claim that I can do this justice in a few minutes. So I'll open here next week with some good, robust stuff to talk about, but I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. And that is, bewitched has a lot of ways of being translated. One of them has to do with to cast an evil eye. One old Greek translator said it was a word that used to be used as in snake charming. that the music would charm the cobra, come up out of that basket. And so maybe Paul has walked through the market at Galatia and saw a snake charmer and thought, this is the way the church is acting. You know, the unemployed enemy ain't even got a weapon, but he's got a flute and he's playing his music, and the church is just mesmerized on their own performance. And they're getting drunk on their own goodness. And believe you me, we do. We get intoxicated with works. You're going to hear a lot of this again next week, so just hold it. We get intoxicated with works, and we get obsessed with more of them, and it just like a snowball rolling down a hill. And Paul goes, you guys are like, you're stunned. You've been hypnotized. You've been bewitched. And then another thing, and I want you to dwell on this. Paul said, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified. They didn't see Jesus die on the cross. The churches at Galatia are full of dudes from all over the edge of the Roman Empire. They were not probably none of them were in Jerusalem on the day Jesus died. So what does Paul mean? This is a guy who has preached Christ crucified so much that he thinks the Galatians have a pretty good image of Jesus dying. And that's what I envy. That's what I want to be. I want you to leave our group and say, gosh, it was as if I saw Jesus die in those lessons. That guy talks about the cross so much that all I could see was Jesus dying and resurrecting. And I think that's where Paul is. And that's what bugs him. You know, how could you guys do this? Well, as always, nobody ever says it better than Eugene Peterson. Eugene Peterson actually wrote the message. I think I probably told you guys this, but I'll tell you again. Eugene Peterson actually wrote the book of Galatians first in his message translation. And he did it because he was teaching Sunday school at his home church. And his class loved his style because he would say to them, well, here's what I think this verse means. And they went, why don't you write all that down? And he, after much debate, decided to do exactly that. And went over so well that he ended up, of course, writing his own paraphrased translations we call the Message. So this was the early stages. I just always like to see what he has to say. I'll close tonight with this. Eugene Peterson's Galatians chapter 3, verse 1. You crazy Galatians, did someone put a spell on you? Have you taken leave of your senses? Something crazy has happened. For it's obvious that you no longer have the crucified Jesus in clear focus in your lives. I love that, man. What a statement. His sacrifice on the cross was certainly set before you clearly enough. It's Paul's way of going, it ain't my fault. Because I have put Jesus in front of you so much, you could smell the blood dripping off that cross. He goes, something has tricked you. And I'll say this to you, something has tricked us into believing that there's something else to be done other than what Jesus has done at the cross. And we're going to deal with that trickster next week. And deal with that trick. And there's a bunch of questions coming. He just asked one, but he's going to ask a few more, and we'll work on them with him next week. Let's pray. How do you pray on this? Well, I think you know. Ask the question. Did Christ die for nothing? I don't know. I can't answer it for you. I know I got to answer it for me. But just do a little bit of inventory. Am I living in a way in which I believe Christ died for nothing? Because how do you know? Pastor, how do you know? How do I know if I'm acting as if he died for nothing? Well, how much are you expecting God to do based on what you do? How much have you been bringing before God as payment for God to bless you, for God to favor you? How much do you think God's holding back because you're not doing well enough? Those are areas in which you're allowing Christ to die in vain. Father, I thank you tonight for this word. I thank you for how real it has been to me. Forgive me, Father. I've been stupid. I've been foolish. I've been crazy. I've been snake charmed. Drunk on my own podcasting, preaching, writing, teaching, answering questions, doing. Thinking that if I could just squeeze out a little more once in a while, you'd do this or that, or boy, I should have done that differently. If I'd have just moved that. Forgive me. Give me a fresh revelation of the crucified Christ and just how finished the finished work is, so that I don't ever have to answer the question, did Christ die in vain? I don't ever again have to say, yeah, at least in the way I'm acting. So, Father, may we not be quick to answer it, but may we answer it individually. And may the answer ever be, no, he didn't die in vain, because I want to receive all that he paid for, and never give the enemy the equipment again. And I pray this for me, and I pray this for everybody listening and here, that in real time or 10 years down the road, the power of the Spirit's just as real. And I pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you for joining us for this week's program. If you would like more information, please visit our website at paulwhiteministries.com. Here you can find thousands of sermons, shop for Pastor Paul's books and series, and become either a monthly partner or a one-time donor. You can also visit our church website at midlandsgardenchurch.org. For written correspondence or to donate by check, write us at Paul White Ministries, P.O. Box 1030, Flowery Branch, Georgia, 30542. Join us again next week here in the Garden of Grace.